Right. So panel number 3. I am SK from SE Ventures, so I'll be moderating this particular panel regarding advancing digital safety. How do we balance distributed self-governance with centralized governance in the metaverse? But before we sink into topic, let me start by introducing the panelists for this particular panel. In fact, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves and the organization that they represent. I'll start with my immediate left with Walter, and then perhaps we'll work our way down. So over to you, Walter.
Sounds good. My name is Walter Lee. I'm from NEC. Delighted to be here. I'm the head of the Public Safety Consulting in Asia Pacific, and I'm an evangelist for digital ID. And now I'm trying to look at verified digital identity, verified avatars, verified wallets, and verified communities in the metaverse.
All right, thank you. I'm Cedric Lindenmann. I'm a technology lawyer at Overy. So I advise clients on strategic digitalization projects, innovative new solutions, etc. And for those who don't know, Overy is an international law firm. I think around 40 offices around the world. Historically known as the law firm for the banks, a banking law firm. I think we're trying to change that into a technology law firm. So we've invested a lot in the US, in the West Coast, opening offices in Silicon Valley, but also here in APAC. So my move from Europe to Singapore is actually also part of that bigger plan.
Hi, thanks for having me here. My name is Nizam Ismail. I run Ethikom Consultancy. So we are a compliance consultancy based in Singapore, Southeast Asian focus. We work a lot with financial institutions, fintech firms, constituents from the blockchain community, DeFi community on various regulatory and compliance issues. I used to be a regulator. That's the reason that I'm in this line of work. And this particular focus also used to be in financial institutions as either legal counsel or head of compliance.
And hi, I'm Adrian Fisher. I'm also an external lawyer, like Cedric. I'm a partner at Linklaters, and I've been kind of in the region. I'm originally from Australia, but outside of Australia and in the broader APAC region for about 10 years. Advising clients also on digitization. And I brought with me my avatar. I really should update the photo, but that's my metaverse avatar. 5 years younger with a haircut. Good to be here.
Hi, thank you for having me. And that really is me, not my avatar. But my name is Robin Lee. Today, I have 2 roles. I'm the head of APAC for Napier Technologies, which is a RegTech startup that offers an end-to-end AML platform. And then simultaneously, I'm also the global fintech liaison for the US Department of Justice's fintech sector public dialogue, which is a public-private partnership that focuses on fintechs. And in particular, the reason why I'm here is that our last session focused on the metaverse, so there's some great sharings that I can bring along from that. My background is such that I started my career in Silicon Valley. I was originally a developer, then realized very quickly that I didn't want to be coding for the rest of my life. So then transitioned from that to Wall Street, where I worked in the hedge fund industry as an analyst covering technology companies. Then after that, I subsequently moved to Singapore about 10 years ago, where I've been involved in the financial crime space, whether that be from an education perspective, a startup perspective, which was subsequently acquired by Nizam, actually, in one of the firms that he worked for. And then prior to Napier, I was actually the head of market development for risk and reg tech for what was Thomson Reuters and subsequently Refinitiv and now London Stock Exchange Group. Thank you.
So thank you very much, panelists, for the introduction. I think there's a lot of credentials on sitting on this panel, and I'm actually really looking forward to this particular conversation. But perhaps let me start by setting the scene a little bit, right? So the key kind of topic that we're talking about here today is governance. And I think governance at times can often is misconstrued with red tape, a lot of paperwork, time delays, and with heavy-handed, I think approach towards governance as a topic. But I think what we're trying to kind of discuss today is not that type of governance, but rather, what sort of rules should be put in place in governing the space that's called Metaverse, right? And I think the reason why, as we previously discussed, is without that set of rules, it's very difficult to kind of commercialize this space, because it will remain a space where people are wary about, people are may not be comfortable, as perhaps retail customers may not be as comfortable venturing into without a clear set of rules. So that's kind of our focus on the governance discussion today. I remember when we had our kind of kickoff call, Nizam, I will turn over to you to start off, because the first thing that Nizam actually raised is, well, before we talk about governance, let's talk about the metaverse that we are looking to govern to start off with. Is it the whole thing? Is it part of it? Is it the centralized bit? Is it the decentralized bit? So perhaps let me start with that question posted to Nizam and the rest of the panel, which is, what is the metaverse we're looking to govern here?
That's a good one. I think we were struggling to find this distinct creature or being that is, has a big metaverse label on it that's distinctly different from, the kind of things that we're used to on the mobile phone, right? And I think that also presents peculiar challenges for regulators. So regulators are trying to be innovative, to keep tabs with innovation. I remember this quote by Ravi Menon at a FinTech festival some years ago, where he said that, by definition, regulation will always lag behind innovation. That's a necessity. But he said that regulators should try to run alongside innovation. There's been lots of exhortation about what it means to be a decentralized metaverse. There are advocates who say that it's deregulated, and I think that's a misperception, that decentralized doesn't mean deregulated. Because if you think about the various reasons or rationale, underlying philosophies why regulations exist, they exist in the metaverse, right? When you think about money laundering, terrorist financing, when you think about consumer protection, when you think about financial soundness of intermediaries, that you want to have your assets there, something as fundamental as that, fair market practices, product disclosures, etc., etc. All those exist, and the raison that for regulation will exist still. In as much as when cryptos first came about, people were saying that cryptos cannot be regulated, right? So they are decentralized. But look where we are right now, many years down the road, where I think most jurisdictions regulate crypto intermediaries, exchanges, or dealing platforms. And in Singapore, of course, we have the Payment Services Amendment Act, which will also regulate a further set of activities within the crypto space. And then the DeFi proponents put up their hands and said, you can't regulate DeFi, there's nobody to regulate, it's just a bunch of algos. Interestingly, in response to that, the MES also said that they would fundamentally shift their regulatory thinking and look at regulating activities rather than regulating players. So I think it's still a very dynamic environment. Regulations are probably shifting a lot quicker than they ever did before, and I think that will continue to be the trend going forward.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that with perhaps a very strange view of the metaverse. I think that the metaverse that we are advocating now will take off when we look on the mesh of the metaverse to the known world that we have today. Look at e-commerce, what happened 20 years ago, right? We talk about brick and mortar, click and mortar, and how the e-commerce took off was when the two economies, the brick and mortar and click and mortar, meshed together. So because of that, we're talking about moving goods and services on the metaverse. There's this issue of regulation coming. Someone asked me, what do you mean? I say, if there's no money on the table, there's no crime to be committed. If there's no crime to be committed, you don't have to regulate anything, So because money is on the table, regulation begins. And therefore, my view is that we're looking really at the IoT of the physical universe that will merge the virtual universe. And any transaction that we're talking about now has to allow the individual on avatar to be able to transact goods and services that used to be transacted in the physical universe. And hence, the regulations that we need to have must ensure that his identity is verifiable, his assets are verifiable, and the marketplace that he is transacting are verifiable. But as I totally agree, I think the regulations, unfortunately, will never catch up. So therefore, we need to have that freedom, I think, to navigate for all the players who are online right now.
Yeah, I can go next. And just to respond to that, I mean, there are a few interesting things there, right? Because I think, first of all, I agree that regulators probably shouldn't regulate right now and allow innovation to play its part first. But I think the second thing is that I think the metaverse does raise some interesting social issues, which we can maybe talk about. Because I do agree, when money's on the table, we have high value assets, regulators get involved, particularly MAS or financial regulators. But I do think that the metaverse creates, just opportunities for social crimes. And I think that's going to be quite interesting to see how it develops and how governments respond to that. But to the first point around how we should govern the metaverse, yeah, I actually found the first two panels very interesting because I'm still learning, really, and actually hearing from people who are creating the tech is fascinating to understand where we're up to, how developed it is, or how not developed it is. And I think we're probably going to end up, presumably, with layers of governance and regulation. We've mentioned regulators, and they might come in at kind of almost towards the end of the development process. But I think first, I mean, a lot of being a lawyer and figuring out how to paper things is about understanding what they are. And so I think it'll be important to understand who the players are in the different metaverse. And I think initially a lot of the governance will be contractual. Just like when you sign up to Instagram or whatever, you've got user terms that you need to sign up to and abide by. And presumably the communities also will create their own rules of how to play the game. So I think that kind of internal governance, that almost contractual governance, is going to be pretty important to start off as well.
I mean, sorry, well.
Oh yeah, I was gonna add to all those points then, and I really like what they were talking about in the earlier panels about user experience and about content, and it just kind of reminds me of it's funny, it's being re-released now, but when the first Avatar movie came out, right, and this is 2009, and I remember when this came out, there were hundreds and thousands of cases globally of people being diagnosed with depression. Because the 3D was so good at the time, you really felt like you were in that virtual world with the blue people and the upside down mountains, that people were getting depressed from it because it felt so real. And so yeah, I think that as the technology has gotten better and the experience has gotten better over the years, hence the adoption and hence the financial element that's coming with that.
I mean, I completely agree. I think it's super interesting how this is going to evolve right over time. I think this panel so far has kind of touched on the two kind of key extremes of how you could potentially govern metaverse. You've got the centralized model, you've potentially got the very decentralized corporate model that Adrian talked about as well, where you've got companies governing it as opposed to regulators governing it. So these are kind of the two very obvious set of people who perhaps has skin in the game in trying to govern these two spaces. Any thoughts on the panel as to which way we're most likely to sway? Having a bunch of ex-regulators, lawyers on the panel, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So maybe just to take a step back when it comes to regulating the metaverse. When I was first asked to speak on this panel on the law of the metaverse, I was thinking, well, I've seen this before. Is this not just the law of the horse? And maybe to explain myself, understanding that not everyone knows the law of the horse. So back in 1996, there was a conference on cyber law in Chicago. And one of the speakers, Judge Frank Easterbrook, said, well, there's no such thing as a cyber law. There's no such thing as the law of the horse. There's contract law in relation to the horse. There's tort law in relation to the horse. There's property law in relation to the horse, but there's no horse law. And so basically, he was at a conference on cyber law saying, guys, you're wasting your time. There's no cyber law. I don't want to go as far, but I do think he has a point. It's when we talk about regulating metaverse, let's look at the tools we have. Let's look at contract law. Let's look at property law, see how far it gets us. And only then, when we see gaps, when we see issues, then see, okay, how can we regulate it? And I think then the next step is not necessarily, does a regulator need to regulate it, but are there other ways to solve it? One of the examples, and actually one of so this whole law of the horse speech initiated a whole academic discussion. And so a lot of professors tried to kind of counter the point. And one of them was Lawrence Lessig, famous professor. He's not doing internet law or cyber law anymore. But back then that was his clear focus. And he said, well, code is law. So you can actually on the cyberspace or on the metaverse, you can code things. One of the examples we've seen in the past, so Second Life, but also recently, there's been stories about people being, sexually harassed on the metaverse or in Second Life. But you can easily code your metaverse to not allow for those things, to not allow for sexual harassment or other crimes. So I think that's one solution, really. Another one is just see how the industry reacts to it. Taking the example of the music industry in the 2000s, everyone said music industry is dead. Well, they completely reinvented themselves. They started, instead of like fighting it, they started just getting into license agreements with YouTube, with the platforms. So now all of us are using our Spotify, Netflix, etc. And the music industry is definitely not what it was 20 years ago, but it's still alive. So I think before that we go into the question of do we really need to regulate, I think let's look at what are the alternatives and only then go into regulation exactly to avoid that red tape.
Yeah, first and foremost, I say I totally agree with the views expressed, 100%. And I think it is not between centrally managed governance and regulation as well as decentralized. I think it is not also a case of both, but I think you begin first with self-governance, meaning within the communities, that is the decency you need to have, right? To have the self-governance. And it's only when the self-governance start to get into issues, right? Then your central authorities need to come in to set certain ground rules. So I think it will be both. And I being a geek myself, and when I'm not working in a day and not spending my time, and I don't play video games or play computer games. I love to write computer games, right? And you don't write your computer games based on governance and regulations. You don't begin that way, right? I mean, just now there was an earlier panel about some of the website being very boring, because that's really your wrong entry point. I think it's from a CX experience, customer experience, and what we want to do with those customers. So therefore, I think it begins first with self-regulation to make our interaction in that virtual community worthwhile. And only in the case whereby that doesn't work, then the centralized regulators need to step in to begin to create a set of rules and regulations that is meaningful for all the communities.
I'm not sure that would work, though. I mean, just to take a contrarian view, it's nice, it's ideal to say that when self-regulation works, then there's no need for regulation. I think regulators might not see it that way. I mean, of course, to be honest, a lot of regulators would hesitate to regulate something unless they fully understand how it works. And typically it means waiting and seeing and also seeing how failures happen. And invariably self-regulation is not, it's never a perfect scheme or system, and there will be failures that will happen. And furthermore, if a particular activity is very much akin to what is already regulated within financial services, chances are regulators will look at it more closely. So even when you offer various forms of digital assets and you think it's great because it's on the blockchain and therefore you've got DAOs and everything else regulating it, you don't need regulation. But in truth, if it mimics a particular financial instrument closely, regulators will tend to look at it the same way. And even on the subject of decentralized autonomous organizations, I think the law is really catching up. Even I'm not even sure whether it's attempting to catch up, but in most jurisdictions, there isn't a legal recognition that a DAO would have the right to own assets, hire people, fire people, or enter into contracts as in its own entity, or whether it is a separate, distinct entity. That the jury is still out on that. So I think there's plenty of moving parts. Of course, the industry is not going to wait for all these things to fall neatly into place, and rightly so. But I think all these other constituents, the law professors, judges, regulators, really need to take a very proactive stance on this.
Yeah, and I would add to that that I agree. I mean, I think when we look at the metaverse and activities on there, you shouldn't assume what you do on the metaverse is not regulated, because as you say, if you're doing something which is illegal in the real world, I mean, it's illegal in the metaverse, right? I mean, I do think self-regulation will likely play a part, because as I understand it, metaverses are communities, right? And so the people in those communities, will have their rules about how they interact with each other. And I guess that there are two things which will then potentially have a consequence on how that governance works out. One is what that metaverse is actually used for, because presumably, I guess a metaverse where you're doing something that's quite, like playing a game or something that has less real world consequence, I guess there's probably less need for really harsh regulation. If you're transacting, if you're using the metaverse for banking transactions or something, then obviously it's a bit more serious. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is trust and transparency, and I think we've seen that through the whole blockchain and crypto just phase that we're going through at the moment. There are some organizations which think a lot, are very sophisticated, mature. They've given thought to how they're going to create their, whatever they're creating, and how they're going to interact with users, and others that have just taken people for a ride. And I'm guessing in the world of metaverse, we're going to have the same thing, where some people are just there to make money. And I would say the industry will serve itself well and allow regulators kind of more time to think about things if they act in a way that's trustworthy. I guess the more that people are trying to use the metaverse to take people for a ride, that's when the regulators are going to start really getting involved, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think based on what Walter and then Nizam and Adrian you're saying, I think it's almost like an evolution of that particular process, right? There is a basic set of expectations that you would expect, all players within the metaverse to be adhering to, as you say, Walter, right, out of common decency, right? This is what you expect everyone to kind of behave, or 99.9% of people to behave. And then when the commercial aspect comes in, as you said, Adrian, that adds the additional complexity around, well, where there is money to be made, there's crime to be had as well, right? Because that's typically when people's behavior starts to kind of alter to actually extract value out of it, right? I mean, I remember speaking to Robin very early on in one of our conversations, and he coined this term called meta crime, which I found super interesting. And he then talked about, I remember you talked about an identity, meta identity, to be able to look at meta crime. So would you be able to just expand a little bit on that, Robin?
Sure. So first and foremost, I didn't come up with the term. Okay, I'll be 100% clear on that. It was a term that's actually repurposed by Karen Kenney from the US Department of Justice. She had a different meaning before, but specifically with respect to metaverses, she came up with the term metacrime. And it could be a range of everything from the sexual harassment incident that was mentioned earlier, to money laundering, to even, as was mentioned in the earlier panels, our lives are gradually moving up there as the user experience gets better, right? We're going to do more and more things. And so, if I'm a terrorist, for example, right, instead of flying buildings into planes, I can just take down a metaverse, right? It's I can do just as much damage doing that, and on, it's a lot easier, it's more, it's cheaper as well, et cetera, than again, getting those planes, hijacking them and flying them into buildings. So that's the definition of metacrime. And I think, from our last conversation as a panel, the scenario which would really interest me would be if I was to take 3 separate metaverses. Okay, metaverse 1, I'm Robin Lee, my job is up there, I get paid in that particular currency. So that's what I call my working metaverse. Metaverse 2, I am Mickey Mouse. Okay, and in metaverse 2, it is my social metaverse, where I hang out with my friends and we sit down and have coffee and talk about the football or something, right? And then metaverse 3 is a work out to earn metaverse, where I do my virtual runs or my sit-ups, push-ups, et cetera, and the more I work out, the more I get paid for it. Okay, and that has a separate currency, and in that metaverse, I'm known as Donald Duck. Okay, so this is a good one for you, Walter. Is how do I know that Robin Lee is the same person as Mickey Mouse and as Donald Duck? So that's number one, the identity challenge, right? And then number two is I have inter-metaverse transactions to track, cross-metaverse transactions to track. Am I making money of this, of the different tokens or currencies that I'm using in these respective metaverses? So you want to talk about cross-border, which is something that we regularly do in AML. Think cross-metaverse here, okay? And you don't even have to leave the country for this one.
Thank you for that leading question. I love that because that's where my passion is that I would suggest that among all this multiverse that we are traversing, right? Yeah, I also wear a fitness watch whereby you'll be surprised in Singapore you get paid, just for walking. So I get walking and the National Health Agency pay me $5 like a week, and FOC. I get a watch free, I get to exercise for free, and I earn my Starbucks coffee, right? So I think that among all the multiverse, yes, there is a need whereby we need to have a verifiable digital identity. But my view is that it had to be something that is opt-in, that the user chose to want to do so because of whatever reason. Use the tokens across the multiverse and so on and so forth. And then I threw a subject into the discussion with my colleagues and my European colleagues in particular, it was very quiet. And when Europeans are quiet, it means they are not necessarily Japanese who are disagreeable, but they have some other view. I would throw into the equation that other than blockchain, biometrics is a very interesting way of being the platform to unite. Now, I bring it up, then I bring quickly an example up. I say, I know, many people are concerned with privacy, many people are concerned with scalability, cultural bias, and so forth. I say, let's bring up India, 1.3 billion population and counting. It increases by 100 million every few months. 1.3 billion population, the largest democracy in the world, arguably the most diverse culture in the world, and they have digitized their identity 12 years ago. First country in the world, the largest democracy in the world to do it, and using biometrics to do that. I would argue that a country like India will leapfrog the rest of us to be able to navigate the multiverse and the metaverse ahead of all countries in the world because they already have a platform to tag the identity.
Okay, but let me see if I can complicate this a little bit for you. Some of these metaverses that we've been looking at are actually going as far as trying to set themselves up as separate sovereign states. Okay, so you need a passport to get in. They have their own police force there that could stop and search you. How would you manage that? And again, address that challenge that I mentioned earlier.
I would love to be in a self-sovereign country, not because I'm not happy living in Singapore, because I think it'll be slightly larger than Singapore. It's such a small place to live in, right? So in this self-sovereign country, it'll be the universe. One of the opportunities that we could explore is the fact that we can learn a lot from passports, e-passports, right? All of us have to go from one country to another for many years. In fact, hundreds of years ago, passports was already invented. Would you believe that? And biometrics was also used in passport hundreds of years ago, your fingerprint. So an example of that is what ICAO, the International Association of Travel and Transportation, is trying to establish. And that is how do you have an e-passport that go across different jurisdictions, different countries. So the idea is that if you are able independently in each country, allowing individuals on their individual multiverse to tag onto those, then again, that could be one way of arbitrating your identification. So there's one suggestion, one possibility that we can explore.
Well, I mean, it's super interesting that you've raised, a couple of the key kind of elements when it comes to the metaverse, right? Where you've got privacy, you've got digital assets, you've got all these different areas which currently is being, as Cedric says, there is a set of law at the moment that governs it in what we call the real kind of the kind of real environment, real universe that we live in today. But I wonder how ready are these laws and regulations in terms of governing the metaverse? Is it fit for purpose? If not, how much do we expect the uplift to be? I see the lawyers is ready to answer this one.
Well, I was about to say, this is a question you don't want to answer, because then you'll rewatch it in 10 years and be like, oh, That was pretty wrong.
That's the main purpose of that. So perhaps over to you.
I think it's going to be fascinating to see how regulators respond. So I don't have an answer for you, but I mean, I think a lot of laws are there for a lot of the issues that you're talking about. I mean, privacy, Cedric would know in Europe, it's kind of over-regulated, some might say, you could argue, and the regulators are very on top of things. I mean, I think what's going to be interesting, say, if you take privacy, is two things. I think how it will be applied to the metaverse practically, and secondly, who will enforce it and how, right? So if you take something like ad tech, I think ad tech is going to be really interesting in the metaverse, because right now, you know, we've got ads just being pushed out to us on our phones. You know, they know that you're going to get engaged. They send you a diamond ad or something. On the metaverse, there's so many advertising opportunities, right? And you know, it's going to be a place where people may want to push out so many ads, and there's so much data that you can collect. Now we have laws about how you collect data, how you process it, how you're supposed to use it, who you're supposed to give it to, but will people follow them in the metaverse? How will you get consent from people? How will you give notices? So that's the first interesting thing. And then the second thing is who will enforce it? Because you know, I mean, companies that will run the metaverse, can you track them down? Where will they be registered? Who will be behind them? How are you going to find that out? So even if there's a huge privacy breach in one metaverse, I mean, how are you going to pin that down? So I haven't answered your question intentionally, but there are a couple of interesting ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree with Adrian. It's a difficult one to answer, but it's going to be an interesting evolution. I think one of the things we've seen, so GDPR, for example, it's this extraterritoriality, right? Recently, you have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act in Europe that have been voted, so they're going to come into effect in the next 6 months or so, I think. And when it comes to ad tech, for example, one of the obligations, I think, in the Digital Services Act, if I'm not mistaken, is you will have to indicate on social media platforms whether it's an advertisement or not. But that works for Instagram, that works for TikTok. Indeed, you know, influencers show that actually they're not just putting on makeup from a specific brand, but they're actually being paid for by that brand, right? But in the metaverse, if you walk around the metaverse and you see publicity, it's basically like in the real world. So would you then have to have an ad with like a line underneath saying this is an ad? So that's actually an example of the regulator trying to regulate cyberspace in 90s kind of language, and suddenly it's been overtaken by what could happen in the metaverse. But I think those are questions that we'll get to answer gradually. I think one of the interesting questions now, and I don't have the answer to it, is how do you regulate DAOs, right? It was mentioned before in one of the panels, they don't have legal personality. So what happens if things go wrong? And there's also some evolutions there. It's very early days, but I think one of the things, there's a case now in California where the token holders of a DAO are being sued, and the claimants are saying, well, you should be jointly and severably liable. So all of the token holders are fully unlimitedly liable, personal liability, which is, I think, quite drastic. But it might make sense because they're saying, well, you're in fact a partnership, so you should have the full liability of the partnership. The decision isn't out yet, but I mean, we'll see. I think it wouldn't be a good thing probably for innovation, for DAOs, if the judge would agree with that theory, because it will really stifle people from getting into DAOs and getting involved. Another one which I found interesting is the Koala Model Law on DAOs. So Koala is a coalition of automated legal applications. They drafted a model law with the intention, a bit like the UNCITRAL models that you have on contract law and etc., for DAOs, hoping that member states, or well, not member states, but nation states would actually take over the DAO. And the interesting bit there, I think, is they're focusing on functional equivalence and on regulatory equivalence. So to give a easy example of that is your signature or your e-signature. Legislators in a lot of countries have decided, well, an e-signature has the same function as a normal signature, so it will have the same legal effects as well. And so with DAOs, you can also look at, okay, what is it they're doing? So if it's on a permissionless blockchain, it has a public address, it kind of gives the same transparency or same, publicity as a legal entity would have. They have to register in a registry with the courthouse or the public registry somewhere. Well, if it's on a blockchain and everyone can actually consult it, it comes to the same effect. So that's one criteria where we could say we don't need to have like this typical, paper filing obligation, but there's something similar there. So they have a number of these things in that model law where they say, well, you could have actually a DAO with a legal personality while still trying to maintain the flexibility that will allow for innovation. It's early days. I might be completely wrong in 10 years' time, but it's someone else I think mentioned it. It's discussions that we will need to have proactively now, and through, I think, through failures, etc., we'll have to learn.
If I could jump in, I think my take on your question, are the laws now fit for purpose? My response is, I think we have seen quite a relentless pace of regulatory change in Singapore. I mean, people talk about cryptocurrencies as the currency that will power the metaverse, right? But let's look at things as they happen. In about 2014, 2015, the question was asked of the MES, would you regulate cryptocurrencies? The question was, of course not, because you could sense that apart from money laundering, there's no real reason to regulate it. Otherwise, you might legitimize it. That was the nuance that we sense. But then in 2018, the MES issued guidance on the offering of digital tokens, or ICOs for that matter. And then it became a crazy, 2017, a crazy moment in the development of rightly or wrongly. We've seen the ICO boom, and then it went bust very quickly as well. 2020 Payment Services Act, that was an attempt to regulate crypto exchanges, crypto dealing. There was a unique specific notice for crypto players, apart from other payment players. So they were special because of specific risks that were being perceived. And then in 2021, there was an Amendment Act to widen the scope of activities under the PSA to include custody, to include intermediation or brokering deals in cryptos. And then there was another legislation passed, which was the Financial Services and Markets Act, which regulates Singapore entities that offer crypto activities to non-Singapore residents. And this is all within a matter of months. And we know that there's been an announcement that there will be a consultation paper issued by the MES next month to regulate stablecoins and to look at issuer liability and to look at, if you say their underlying assets, is there a process to audit it, and things like that. So within the last couple of years, there's been massive changes, and I think the pace of regulation will also continue going forward. And I think it goes back to the earlier point that you don't want to see regulation front-running innovation because it will just kill it. But I think regulators are now being, the demand of the job that they have to be hypersensitive to the change in the industry.
I think, thank you very much. I think we're up against time. And so therefore, I'm not going to be opening up to the floor for question. I think, we started with one question, we ended up with more questions because I think this is an ever evolving space at this point in time. And thank you to the panelists for being here, and we'll continue to observe the space as we move along. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.